At 3:19 a.m, my phone buzzed with the fraud alert showing my debit card in use for a room charge at Maplewood Suites on West Wren Avenue. Chip present while my wallet sat closed on my nightstand, and my wife was supposed to be halfway through a respiratory night shift. A follow-up ping landed 30 seconds later. A separate authorization for a vending kiosk in the same lobby, a bottled iced coffee and a candy bar I hadn't tasted since high school. 10 minutes after that, a rideshare receipt slid into my email listing me as a tipper for a driver named Leland. Pick up from that same hotel at 3:31 a.m. and drop off 2 blocks from Stillmont Regional Hospital's employee entrance. We live in Ashford, North Carolina, a place where the air tastes like pine and hot asphalt in summer, and everyone knows more about your yard than you do. Our house is a 2-bedroom rental on Carmel Court, a short cul-de-sac behind a Food Lion and a UPS store with a row of crepe myrtles that stain the sidewalk pink every July. I keep the yard clean and the gutters clear. She keeps the freezer stocked with frozen waffles for our son and hosts a little corner of succulents on the kitchen ledge that I forget to water. We have a 6-year-old who doesn't understand why some nights smell like peppermint and hand sanitizer when his mother gets home, why sometimes the laundry basket contains a stranger's chapstick, or why his father leans on the counter with his head in his hands. I work maintenance planning at the poultry processing plant 3 miles away on Arden Road, the one that hums through the night and looks like a floating pastel wedding cake when the lights reflect off the steam. My life is scheduling downtime and parts orders so lines don't stall. The least glamorous version of logistics you can imagine. She's a respiratory therapist at Stillmont Regional, the kind of clinician who moves around ICU beds like a choreographed storm, swapping canisters and checking numbers with a steady hand while monitors do their digital beeping chorus. Our schedules have always been a puzzle box, my shift starting at 6 a.m, hers flipping from days to nights and back again, with a shared calendar that looks like a game of Tetris dealt by someone who hates us. Before the charges, the routine was almost comfortable. I brewed coffee at 5:20, left by 5:40, cut down locusts to avoid school bus routes, parked in the side lot by the tanks. I ate in the break room around 10, came home by 3:30, handled pickup at Maple Ridge Elementary, did 40 minutes of sight words and 30 of screen time if he was lucky, made something with ground turkey, and watched the stove clock tick to 8:30 like it always would. On nights she worked, I fell asleep around 10:30 with the TV turned low and woke at 2:00 a.m. to find the house too quiet. There had been small red flags you only see in retrospect. She started buying a different kind of gum she never picked before, an extra strong peppermint that lingered in the car even when the windows were down. Her hair ties migrated to the glove box, and an unfamiliar key appeared on her ring. A modest, dull key with a black plastic top that didn't look like anything from our house, our car, or our storage closet. Her phone began to spend more time face down on the coffee table. She claimed extra nights at Stillmont that didn't line up with the payroll cycle I helped her track for taxes. I found parking tickets from downtown on Saturdays when she said she was visiting her friend in the next county. Cash went missing in dribbles, 10 here, 20 there. She started keeping her tote bag zipped on a chair, even in our kitchen. I told myself it was fatigue. I told myself she was covering shifts for a friend or tethering extra hours to pay off her student loan sooner or buying surprise gifts early. We'd had bigger problems than gum in the glove box. A burst pipe last fall had soaked the pantry and ruined a month of groceries. My truck's transmission had failed without courtesy or warning, leaving me with a $3,000 bill and 5 days of missed work when parts ran late. Our son's asthma flared that spring when wildfires upstate pushed haze into our zip code, which meant 2 ER visits and a copy that felt like a slap. We kept telling ourselves we were almost past the tight months, that tax season would come with relief, that the new insurance year would start clean. The night of the Maplewood charge, I stared at the screen for so long the display dimmed. The app showed the hotel address, 1880 West Wren, across from a closed diner with a neon sign still clinging to life. My card had been dipped, it said, not keyed. I opened my wallet, thumbed the edge of my debit, felt the notch on the side of the chip where I once nicked it by accident with a box cutter. It was present. The bank's machine insisted it had been present somewhere else. In the 5 minutes before I did anything, a construction of excuses rose and collapsed and rose again. Maybe the hotel ran a batch from a previous stay, except I hadn't stayed in a hotel in 2 years. Maybe the kid at the desk keyed the wrong card number, except the app offered an icon for chip inserted. Maybe she'd borrowed it, except I had the card and the wallet and the phone that was receiving the alert, and the drop-off happened near her hospital's employee entrance 2 minutes after I left the hotel that had taken a tip from my email address. I checked the shared calendar. Her shift block was green. I opened our carrier's app and toggled the location history we both forgot we had enabled when we tried to find a missing phone last winter, and never fully disabled again. The map showed her iPhone static on hospital grounds since 3:04 p.m. the day before, but her watch had moved at 3:14 a.m. A wisp of data that said she was in motion away from the patient wing, then offline. At 3:29 a.m., her phone flickered briefly to a cell tower near West Rend before dropping again. The world is full of glitches and coincidences that only start to look like proof after you line them in a row and squint. I didn't drive to the hotel. I've replayed that decision 100 times. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, the laminate warm from the dishwasher's seat, and wrote down every charge in the last 8 weeks on a sheet of yellow paper so I could see if they drew a shape. There were small authorizations in the proximate past that had skipped over me, both e-scooter rentals at 2 a.m. 3 times on a weeknight, 3 inexplicable charges at a place called Ivory and Coal Boutique on Halcyon Street where candles and magnets cost as much as my oil changes, and multiple pulls from a payday loan place whose neon always made me feel itchy when I drove by. I noticed a string of Lyft receipts that referenced her phone line but had my email CC'd as if a setting had been toggled halfway. I could track the drivers through my inbox like a weather map. The hotels were new. The Lyft around 3:31 was new. The charge at 3:19 was not the first hotel, I realized, just the first to demand my attention. I confronted her at breakfast the next day, but the confrontation didn't look cinematic or even competent. I placed the yellow paper between the cereal bowls and asked if she had needed a place to rest before rounds, if the hospital had a deal with Maplewood for on-call naps. She ate standing and left a ring of milk on the table from the spoon. She didn't break stride, but told me she'd been called off mid-shift because census was low, that she had a migraine and took a Lyft to avoid driving, but that she didn't want to wake me at the doorbell. She said she used my card because her wallet was in her locker and she once put my card into her phone in case of emergencies. I remembered I had handed her my card at the pharmacy once last year when her line wouldn't tap, and that would be enough to live permanently in a digital wallet. I remember thinking how quickly an emergency becomes the drawer you keep open. She left for her assigned day shift while I took her Sam to school and sat in the Maple Ridge Elementary drop-off line listening to an NPR segment about warehouse robots picking wrong products because they didn't recognize context. I stared at minivans with decals that signaled simple lives and wondered what kind of work it takes to thread 2 realities at once without letting any neighbors notice. It was our nephew's birthday that weekend, a backyard thing at her sister's place off Serena Lane. All hot dogs and lawn games and kids sprinting through sprinklers while the adults pretended to lose at cornhole. I printed 2 months of bank statements and folded them inside a manila folder that I slid into the diaper bag we still used as a family tote even though no one wore diapers anymore. I told myself I would ask for clarity away from noise, that I would keep the circle small. But some patterns refused to hide. Her mother poured sweet tea at the folding table. Her sister's husband turned burgers with the spatula he treated like a sword. I stood in the shade of a maple tree that had survived 2 hurricanes and a construction project and tried to feel like a normal neighbor. She arrived 40 minutes late in a sundress I had never seen and a stacked bracelet that flashed copper in the sun. I noticed her phone lock screen held a photo from a hiking trail that wasn't one we've ever walked. I saw an unfamiliar backpack in her trunk when I helped her unload a bowl of potato salad. It was a man's backpack, navy canvas with a stitched patch of a mountain that doesn't exist here. I waited until dessert. I waited until the kids were corralled at the picnic table. I asked her if we could talk. She said we could talk there. I said I didn't want to ruin a party. She said nothing was going to be ruined and reached for the paper I didn't realize was half visible in the bag. The table around us quieted in that way families do when a pick changes. I laid out the Maplewood charges, the 3:31 Lyft, the 2 a.m. Scooter rentals no one at her hospital could explain. I mentioned the boutique store, the payday polls. I said I didn't understand and that was the only reason for paper. Her mother's eyes flicked from me to her and back like she was watching a ball. Her sister's neighbour, a pharmacist from the Publix on East Cobb, leaned in far enough to count as a witness even if she didn't mean to be one. The pharmacist would tell me later she had seen my wife twice that month on her lunch breaks with a man whose hand shook when he signed for cough medicine. The pharmacist had no reason to protect me but still managed to say the man was tall and wore a green cap without insignia. She remembered because he asked if discounts could stack. My wife told me I was behaving like a man who didn't trust the people who saved lives for a living. She said hospital staffing made flexibility necessary, that sometimes the hospital sent staff off and then called them back when admissions surged. She said the gum was because all night she wore an N95 and her breath made her nauseous. She said the boutique sold a lotion that was the only thing that soothed the raw spot on the bridge of her nose. She said the payday pulls were for a cousin between checks. I said I could work with all of that if she would agree to have receipts forwarded to me as a sanity measure. She called me controlling. Her mother frowned. Her sister changed the subject to her third cousin's graduation. The pharmacist reached for a slice of cake she no longer wanted. The air felt like it does before a thunderstorm that never comes. An hour later, as I loaded folded chairs into the sedan, an installed tech I recognized from the hospital's partner service walked up with paper cups. He's the kind of person whose face is so open you can't imagine him lying about anything other than a surprise party. He said he overheard, and that he would have kept quiet if he could, but he wasn't built that way. He told me he had run service tickets across the ICU this week and had not seen her on the board except one half shift that he'd then been sent down to HR to sign for an ID and watched an admin field a call from a supervisor frustrated that relief staff had become let go, some showing, some not, some claiming cancelled shifts that no one could verify. He told me he didn't know if that helped or hurt, but felt like I deserved to know. The next day I opened a separate checking account at Piedmont Credit Union and moved half our emergency fund. I called our primary bank and asked for a new debit card with a rush fee. I removed my card from Apple Pay on all devices. The rep filed it under a suspected card present duplicate and gave me a case number that felt like a useless talisman, 1129-481C. I set fraud alerts at all 3 bureaus and a monitoring hold with Equifax that came with a polished email offering tips like freezing your heart. I sent a message from my work email to my personal email with all these numbers and steps so I couldn't lose them. 2 days after I set boundaries, a letter came from a property management firm I didn't recognize, Sunridge Communities. Inside, a late payment notice for Unit 3C on Halcyon Street, addressed to my wife's maiden name. The letter referenced a lease signed in April, a security deposit paid in cash, a pet addendum for a cat she hates. It noted a balance that matched exactly the sum of the payday pulls I wanted to pretend were for a cousin. It contained a phone number and a line about access being restricted to tenants on the lease. The postmark was 2 days prior. The letter felt like a step into a hall of mirrors where every reflection corrected my memory. I walked Halcyon Street at noon on my lunch break like a person measuring distance with their feet. Sunridge Apartments sat across from the boutique she liked, a row of pale orange rectangles with aluminum railings and a post office that looked like someone's grandmother had decorated it in 1991 and no one touched it since. The manager's door had a bell that did not ring. The lobby had a corkboard with dog walker cards and a water cooler that would never be serviced again. Through the glass I could see a list in a plastic frame facing inward on a desk, a names on unit sheet, with 3 lines visible if you leaned. I convinced myself I saw her maiden name on the third. A mailman in uniform walked by with the shoulder motion mailmen haven't said, in a tone stripped of the possibility of misunderstanding, that he saw her here sometimes and that she was polite and picked up packages for box 148 every Friday. He didn't know me, he knew his route. He said the taller man with her once asked how to hold mail temporarily, which was not an apartment question but a P.O. box question, and that's how he knew. I went to the UPS store behind our house that afternoon instead of going back to work. The owner greeted me with the exhaustion of someone who signs for other people's late notices all day. I pulled a handful of recycling from their bin until I found a shredded copy of a mailbox rental form and reconstructed enough of it to recognize the template, then walked home and checked our junk drawer for pens we never used because they feel wrong in the hand. I found a carbon paper copy of a mailbox agreement tucked behind a stack of expired coupons, her maiden name again. Box 148. The start date matching the month our arguments began to tilt weird. In a yellow margin, a note in her handwriting read for returns and private bills. She had not left it to be discovered. She had simply underestimated my patience for cleaning. I drove to Stillmont with a folder that now held too much and asked to see HR. I expected to be turned away, but bureaucracy saved me. A kind man recognized my name from PTA bake sales and ushered me to a small conference room with laminated safety posters. 2 HR staffers joined both with expressions neutral enough to test machines and asked me to explain why I needed them. I put the papers on the table and pointed at specific dates: June 7, June 13, June 22, our claim shifts didn't align with what we were paid, and where we had Maplewood at 3:19 a.m. and a Lyft at 3:31 a.m. that matched the dead hour on the staffing dashboard if one happened to have a spouse with friends who occasionally ran maintenance tickets on said dashboard. HR said the scheduling system was UKG and that it was possible for last-minute changes to fail to update, but an audit for pattern would be reasonable. They thanked me, and I hated them for it, because thanks felt like the kind of word you say in a movie before the plot turns unfair. That night she sensed the temperature and tried to bring mine down with the soft logic of exhaustion. She described staffing crises like weather events, how codes rose and fell with little warning. She told me she had been too ashamed to admit a small debt to an ex-friend and had taken a short-term place to keep peace while she satisfied it, that the apartment was a crash pad for a cousin who just needed a couch, that secrecy sometimes was a kindness. She asked me if I wanted our son to hear his parents whispering numbers instead of reading him a bedtime story. The manipulation was not worse than the action, it was worse because he used the right words in the wrong order. The next twist came not from finances but from medicine. An email landed at 8:03 a.m. from Westview Fertility, a clinic 2 towns over, reminding my wife of a blood drawer schedule and a follow-up consult to review results. The email used her maiden name and an address at Sunridge that we didn't live in. The reason line coded insurance, preconception evaluation. My stomach felt like a cheap elevator. We had argued for months about whether to try for a second child, whether our son could share us, whether our money could absorb daycare again. We had landed on later, which is to say never, because later is a convenient shelf. Her chart portal, tied to my email by an accident of a setting clicked when we filed our taxes, contained lab results with words that read like normal until they didn't. I saw a test panel that included things I didn't recognize and something I did, a paternity probability notation that wasn't filled in because it wasn't ordered, and a note where the father's name field was empty. I asked myself whether I had any right to wonder. I asked myself whether the questions I had were less about ownership and more about betrayal. I asked myself whether any man can stand in his kitchen and decide with clean logic whether to ask a woman he loves to open her life to her lap. Would you demand the test now and tear the window open in front of a child who still thinks adults are good, or wait until the dust settled and risk being told you were late to your own life? Would you march into a clinic with the printout and the urgency of a person who has always believed the world keeps to its rules? Or would you fold back into a routine and call a lawyer before you called a doctor? I did both. I called a lawyer on Dixon Street whose office had a dead ficus and a cheap clock that ticked too loudly. He told me to separate finances, document everything, and keep conversations recorded in writing. He gave me a list of labs certified for legal testing with chain of custody and case numbers. He told me to email her a written notice, unemotional, inviting cooperation for a test that I framed not as an accusation but as a reality check that would, if negative or positive, give us a stable ground. He gave me a rate sheet that felt like punishment for marrying badly. I wrote the email. I kept it factual. I included a proposed date 3 weeks out and 3 lab addresses and a case file number I had reserved without payment, TR-48,321. The independent witness in all of this turned out to be our neighbour, a quiet retiree with a creaky fence and perfect roses. Every morning at 5:45 she walked the stretch of caramel court like she had to teach it to be calm. She handed me a card from her yard sale box the morning I walked to my car with a folder and told me she once kept a journal with exact times of morning deliveries because the noise bothered her and she needed proof when she called the city. She said in the spring before I noticed anything I didn't want to notice. She had jotted down in that journal a pattern she thought was a postal shift my wife's car pulling into our driveway at 4:59 a.m. On 3 different Tuesdays without headlights, idling for a minute, then leaving again toward Lucas Street. She offered me the notebook in case it helped with anything official. She said she didn't want to be in our business but knew a ledger is the only language some offices respect. While I gathered proof like twigs for fire, I wasn't sure I wanted to start. The DMV sent a letter with an image of my signature requesting a duplicate title for our Honda. I had not requested anything. The letter contained a date stamp matched to a morning when, according to the neighbour's rose-plucking timeline, the car idled at our house at 5:01 a.m. The replacement title was to be mailed not to our home address but to the UPS store box. I stood in our kitchen with a letter that said the state believed I had authorised something that would let someone pawn the only car I owned outright. The anger I had been trying to keep at a simmer moved to a boil and then to a clarity that felt like sleep. I drove to the DMV office and waited between a man renewing a commercial license and a woman registering a boat. I asked for a hold on my title and an investigation. The clerk had a protocol for this sort of thing, a form that allowed me to freeze any title activity for 30 days while they requested verification. She handed me a case number and a photocopy of the request. My forged signature looked like a bad tracing. Down the request in neat letters, by a name listed as Evan Reese. I filed a police report not because I thought it would fix anything, but because my lawyer said it would matter. They gave me a case number that made me feel like a guest in my own life, like someone else controlled episodes and seasons. Back home I froze the card on our streaming services and watched the screen glitch into a free trial interface our son didn't deserve. I chose a public scene because I believed sunlight would work like bleach. The hospital HR called to say their audit found inconsistencies. Nothing dramatic, nothing they would declare as a verdict. Only a pattern of claimed but unbilled hours. They asked if I would be willing to attend a meeting if she consented. She did. The meeting was two HR people with laptops, a supervisor with a hairpin smile, and the two of us sitting in chairs spaced apart as if our marriage were contagious. They walked through the dates I had circled. They described missing entries, times when she had swapped shifts without documented approval, and on-call times that looked like coverage but were only ghost ink. They never added moral adjectives. They never used my name. They asked for acknowledgement that pieces were regular. She stared at the wall while they spun the spreadsheet and waited for her to fill blanks. She left that meeting louder than she had entered, but only once we were in the parking garage. She didn't shout words. She let the silence work like a floodlight in which everything looks more exhausted. That night she slept in the second bedroom we used as a catch-all, on a futon that one seemed like a good idea. I heard her cry through the wall, and I didn't know if those tears were for her or for life that had lost the rhythm we lied to ourselves we had. The next reveal was small but felt like vertigo. Our son woke with a fever the morning of the proposed lab test, which meant I couldn't bring him anywhere near a clinic or anyone whose job involved vulnerable lungs. She texted at 6:12 that she had to go to the unit and couldn't reschedule. I watched our son nap as cartoons murmured to an empty room. At noon, a receipt landed in my inbox for an order at a cafe near the clinic, 2 cappuccinos and a lemon bar. The signature line of the receipt auto-printed a name, Evenentic thermal ink. The paternity test didn't happen that day. The appointment was cancelled. The cafe provided more information than any email chain. I dropped off a written notice of separation at the courthouse the next morning with my lawyer's help. It wasn't divorce, not yet. It was a step into the paperwork labyrinth where everything is dated and stamped and smells like toner. I asked for temporary custody guidelines and financial restraint orders. I asked the bank to block any withdrawals that weren't automated or necessary. They accommodated with a note appended to our joint savings like a scold. I asked childcare if we could add an emergency pickup code known only to me. I placed one inside our babysitter's calendar reminder so I wouldn't forget and sent one to our neighbour with the roses. I met the property manager at Sunridge again, this time with a typed letter and my lawyer's business card. The manager, who had been a wall earlier, softened in the presence of official letterhead. He confirmed there was a lease under her maiden name, that the second person had been listed informally as an occupant without official status because the lease was to avoid the headache of adding and removing names. He said they were within rights to bypass me because my name wasn't on the line. He handed my lawyer a copy of an entry log sheet for maintenance entries that accidentally recorded occupant names. 3 entries existed in the last month. On 2 of them, the occupant had printed Evan Reese. The last reveal wasn't from a ledger or a screen but from a doctor's office I hadn't asked to hear from. A nurse from Westview called my number because my email was still attached to a contact line. She said in the kindest voice I've ever heard that my wife had requested a copy of results be sent to a different address and that the initial consult had discussed a condition. Not dire, but affecting fertility, one that often frightened younger women into rash decisions they didn't need to make if they had a partner who would sit with them in fear. She said she couldn't say more without breaching privacy, but thought perhaps I should be part of the conversation. She didn't have to reach out. She did. She didn't know that reaching out would confirm the thing I had been avoiding naming. My wife had not only been stepping outside our marriage for comfort or thrill or gallows relief after bad shifts, she had been building a different structure with different beams. I don't know who the villain is in this story if you stand far enough away. Up close, the villain is every small lie that seems harmless when it is alone and catastrophic when it holds hands with siblings. Up close, the villain is my tendency to assume timing could be wrestled into fairness with enough lists. Up close, The villain is a man with a simple name who drank cappuccinos near a clinic while my email took notes. I wrote her a letter by hand on paper from the pad we use for grocery lists. I wrote that the bank had issued me a new debit card and that any charges pending would be contested if they fell outside groceries, utilities, or our son's care. I wrote that the UPS box would need to close because I no longer had the capacity to pay for cigarettes. I wrote that the lab appointment was rescheduled because I would not parent under fog, and I included a new date and the address and the instruction that if the test turned into a fight, we would move through the court instead of through our kitchen. I wrote that our son would sleep in my room for the time being because he needed to feel more constancy than any one adult could promise. I wrote that I would not speak unkindly to her in front of him, that I would not throw knives of words into the drywall and leave them there, that I would not describe her to our son as something to protect himself from. I wrote that I would protect myself in silence when we needed it, and that she could show me who she was without soundtrack. She moved to the apartment on Halcyon Street not with dramatic boxes but with repeated quiet carloads while our son played with cars on the driveway, the small plastic ones whose wheels leave little crescents in the dust. She took her tote bag, the one she used to zip, and half our forks, because adults make war with weird weapons. She returned 2 weeks later with a box of things I hadn't realized were missing, a book I gave her in the second year of us because it made me think of how she takes care of people, the scarf she wore when we visited my uncle in Charleston, the thermostat manual that only I ever read. She cried on our porch and said I was good. I didn't need her to say that. I needed her to say another thing I didn't hear. HR finished their audit and issued a reprimand that felt calibrated to avoid anything messy. The hospital can live with small lies. They cannot live without staff. My lawyer told me to keep my shoulders low, to hold steady with small steps, to build a record like a fence that does not rust. The DMV froze the title. The bank denied 2 more hotel charges and 1 boutique purchase with such gusto you'd think the denial won a prize. The UPS store sent a notice that box 148 would be closed for non-payment if not settled by the end of the month. I watched the end of the month come and did not pay. I don't know if some part of me still wants to believe a different story is possible. My son asks why we don't eat waffles with his mom on Tuesday mornings anymore, and I tell him schedules are funny and grown-ups work things out. He asks whether the cat in the apartment on Halcyon has a name, and I tell him I don't know, because I don't. I don't know if the man with cappuccinos is cruel or just stupid with romance. I don't know if the notebook with times from our neighbour saved me from making myself a kind of fool you can never recover from. I don't know if writing any of this down makes me a fair narrator. I know only that the numbers on receipts add up, and the dates on emails stack, and the smell of peppermint will take a year to leave the fabric of the car seats. I keep the Maplewood receipt in a folder because it reminds me how lies are often present as trivia. Room 217, 3:19 a.m. Vending machine at 3:21. Lyft at 3:31. Tip at 3:41. The time pattern haunts me, a set of beats at which my life shifted sideways. I sometimes wake at 3:19 a.m. With a start, my body now calibrated to expect a notification, and I stand at the kitchen sink watching the black rectangle of the backyard window reflect the red eye of the stove. The house sounds different at that hour, a long continuous exhale punctuated by the hum of the fridge, the soft hiss where the 8-track doesn't seal perfectly, the intermittent click of the hallway thermostat deciding whether we're too warm. The very first night after she moved out, I watched the microwave clock tick to 3:19 and thought I could hear the faint beep of a hotel door unlocking somewhere distant, a sound like plastic scraping over metal, a thing that decides who lives in which room. It's not a neat ending because none of this is. The lab appointment sits on the calendar with a name that might as well be a question mark. Tri-County Diagnostics, 2 p.m. Chain of custody paperwork printed. Case number TR-48321. The result, whatever it is, will reorder my priorities but not my plan. I'll protect my son's nights. I'll keep my savings where I can see it. I'll be civil in emails and thorough in file names. I'll show up to school events early and sit where the teacher can see I'm present. I'll continue to show my neighbour I appreciate her roses even when I'm too tired to do anything but nod. I'll laugh at work when the maintenance crew tells a story about the pump exploding because they forgot the gasket. I'll cook ground turkey in a dozen different ways until I can afford steak again. On some nights, when the house is quiet and the wind carries sirens in a way that makes you feel like they're your fault, I stand by the front door and look at the curve of the cul-de-sac. The streetlight at the end flickers every 3 minutes, and shadows step over the lawns like neighbours who wandered out and lost their keys. The UPS store sign hums behind the trees even when closed, and the Food Lion's ice machine rattles because it always does. If I listen hard and long, I can almost hear the faint tremolo whine of a quiet lift braking to a stop 2 blocks from a hospital, the door thunking closed, that split second of silence before footsteps cross to a place that isn't mine. The morning after those nights, I pour coffee and set a bowl on the table for a boy whose face is open and expecting the whole world to be simple. I practice making the day light. I write lists in a neat hand that doesn't look like a forgery of anyone else's life. I sign them with my name. On some afternoons I let him play Subway Surfers while I stir a pot, watching colour and obstacles blur and simplify on a screen that doesn't care who pays the bill behind it. When he falls asleep, I clean the counter until the laminate gleams the way manufacturer once promised it would. At 3:19 a.m., when the phone does not buzz and the house holds its breath, I picture a hallway with carpet patterned in blue diamonds and a vending machine glaring into an empty lobby and a single elevator indicator counting floors with stubborn certainty. Sometimes I imagine the elevator stuck between 2 floors, the car idling in a space that is neither here nor there, open to no one, humming it relentless, mine the song while the building sleeps around it.